Do you think your job is gross? Because I think some Victorian professions were definitely worse. Some of them just sound like a joke. Being professionally bitten by leeches is something so unrelatable to a modern person that it kind of seems like that. In the Victorian era, medicine could be described as, well, primitive, and methods such as fluid letting were a common practice for a multitude of medical ailments. One method of doing so to a patient called for applying leeches. And how did you collect them? Well, you had to go to ponds, bogs. They were a very useful commodity. You had a lot of doctors and quacks using the gnarly little creatures to treat a number of ailments. We're talking the headaches, hysteria, you name it. Before the invention of modern medicine, nearly everything was cured by adding leeches to the affected area and hoping for the best. Now, to be fair, leeches do have natural anesthetics and anti-inflammatories in their saliva, so, they'd probably be pretty good at healing cuts that might otherwise get infective, but actively letting out red fluid isn't such a good idea. But here's the thing, pity the poor leech collector who had to use their body as a human trap. The job usually fell to poor countrywomen who would wade into dirty ponds in hopes of attracting a whole host of the little creatures. Once they attached to the leech collector's legs, the individual would prise them off and collect them in a box or a pot. This profession was particularly popular during UK summers, where the soggy environments were kind of ideal. In an account written by George Walker from 1814, apparently this profession was pretty common amongst Scottish women. Turns out leeches can survive for up to a year with no food, so they can be stored at any pharmacy to be dished out as required. Unsurprisingly, leech collectors were in danger of suffering from excess fluid loss and infectious diseases. They actually made themselves redundant because the kind of leech used in the field of medicine became extinct in the early 1900s. Victorian London had a huge network of overworked sewers under the city, washing away all the ickiness of the crowded metropolis. Toshers made their living down in the dark sewers, sifting through raw sewage to find any valuables that had fallen down the drain. As a result of these dangers, Toshers generally worked in groups, instantly recognizable in their trousers, their aprons with a lot of pockets, and lanterns strapped to their chests. A lot of them also carried a long pole with a shovel at the end to investigate piles of human waste for dropped treasures, or with which to steady themselves if they stumbled in the darkness. After 1840, it actually became illegal to enter the sewers without permission, but rather than abandon the trade, Toshers began working late at night or early in the morning to avoid detection. Despite these stinking and dangerous conditions, it was a lucrative business for the working classes, with many a coin or silver spoon sloshing about in the gunk. Today, people do something similar for fun. Mudlarking, but there aren't sewers involved. So at the bottom of the Victorian scavenging economy was this person. They would walk the river banks collecting bits of anything overlooked by other scavengers. These people toiled in extreme poverty, often barefoot in the freezing water of a city's rivers. And hey, you never know what they were going to find. Sometimes bits of metal, bone, or cloth, and you could sell it off. Granted, you have to deal with the dead bodies, human excrement, and rotting fish. Just a little occupational hazard. Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match. Wait a minute. We're not talking about fairy tales today. We're talking about the factories of London. Matchsticks are made by cutting wood into thin little strips and then dipping the ends into white phosphorus, which, if you didn't know, is a highly toxic chemical. So back in the day, this work was mainly performed by some folks that were on the younger side of life, and they worked in terrible conditions, often for, 12 to 16 hours a day with little to no breaks. And the grossness happened after you'd been on the job for a couple of years. So if you're working this many hours in a day, you kind of have to eat at your workstation, meaning the toxic phosphorus got into people's food, leading folks to develop the dreadful condition known as phossy jaw, where the jawbone becomes infected, leading to severe disfigurement. Eventually, the absorption of the phosphorus caused the woman's jaws to take on an eerie glow. Now, the only treatment was an operation to remove the jawbone. Kind of sad. While many medical minds in the 18th and 19th centuries saw human dissection not just as a medical must, but also a vital part of the justice system. Look, the Company of Surgeons in London became legally obliged to conduct public dissections of killers back in 1752, which I know might sound kind of wild for Victorian times, but allow me. Turns out there was only so many killers to go around, and with a seemingly, never-ending need for cadavers, a lot of folks became body snatchers. Or technically speaking, resurrectionists. While the job was lucrative, it was also, dangerous, frickin' disgusting because bodies weren't exactly embalmed, so they'd rot pretty quickly. Despite the clean-sounding name, being a pure finder actually involved collecting dog feces from the streets of London to sell to tanners who used it in the leather-making process. Dog poop was known as pure because it was used to purify the leather and make it more flexible. Leather was in great demand in Victorian times, seeing as it was used for tack for horses, but also for shoes, boots, bags, bookbinding, you name it. Pure collectors haunted the streets where stray dogs amassed, scooping up the excrement and keeping it in a covered bucket before selling it off. Now, some folks did wear gloves to protect their scooping hands, but other folks considered it harder to keep a glove clean than a hand, and they were like, we're gonna get sick no matter what. Doffer is a word that means to remove, and back in the days in a textile mill, a spinning factory worker or doffer would need to remove the full bobbins of yarn from the mules or spinning frames and replace them. Now, their duties often provided them with a lot of time, and some of these folks were young enough to enjoy playtime on company time. A doffer was somebody who would nowadays be like in school in terms of age, and they had the potential to also be promoted to a spinner, which was a higher paid job that was definitely for young people. Now, doffers could also be sweepers, which was a job that included sweeping up the cotton lint in between the doffing runs, but in larger factories these were two separate jobs. This may not have been a gross job, but in terms of labor violations and risk of injury, it's still pretty disgusting. In the 19th century, before a modern sewage system snaked beneath our streets, like I said before, sewage went into deep, open pits. Privies, consisting of a small hut with no door, a seat with a circular hole in the middle, led down into a cesspit to hold the excrement. One privy could be shared by a whole street sometimes. Now, excrement was collected by a night soil man, who was paid by landlords to get rid of their tenants' waste. Some landlords didn't want to pay to have this important job taken care of, so cesspits were allowed to overflow into the streets. And that's how you get cholera, because, well, poor sanitary conditions leads to death. These night soil men would go into the pits, carry up buckets of body waste, and take it to farms to be used as manure. Being a gravedigger was a challenging and often grim occupation, shaped by the harsh realities of life at the time. So these folks would work in remote locations, not often near established settlements. So they faced isolation, they had limited access to resources and support, they had to deal with extreme weather conditions, scorching heat, bitter cold, unpredictable storms, and that made their life pretty hard. Digging graves by hand was back-breaking work. The labor was physically demanding and could take a toll on the body, particularly during long hours of digging in whatever the weather was. Also, they faced a lot of other risks. They were exposed to the risk of contracting diseases from handling decomposing bodies, as well as the potential for injury from sharp tools, falling debris, or accidents while working in remote locations. The constant exposure to death could have negative psychological effects as well, and just overall, their poor backs. Despite the charming depictions of sweeps and Mary Poppins, the job was actually done largely by folks known as climbing boys. As you can imagine, it was quite dangerous for anybody to inhale dangerous amounts of soot that was cleared, but when shorter and skinnier folks did this job, because you kind of had to be, you'd sometimes get stuck, and that's really dangerous. And finally for today, the practice of sin eating was pretty common in Wales back in the day, and it involved eating a piece of bread placed on the chest of a recently deceased person. And in doing so, the sin eater would take on the sins of the departed. So it would ease the deceased soul, but some sin eaters risked arriving at the pearly gates weighed down by the sins of hundreds of others. Being a sin eater often meant you were also shunned in society, because, well, nobody wants to be around you. It also isn't that ancient a practice. The last known sin eater in Britain worked up until his death in 1906. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!